There are moments in history that reshape nations. There are events that bring down empires. And then there are lives that change the course of civilization itself. Approximately 2,000 years ago, in a small province on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire, a child was born. No armies announced his arrival. No palaces celebrated it. No emperor took notice. He would live for approximately 33 years, never travel more than a few hundred miles from where he was born, never write a single word that has survived, never hold a political office or command a military force. And yet, the calendar by which most of the world marks time is organized around the estimated year of his birth. The largest religion in human history, 2.5 billion adherents today, traces itself to his teachings. The laws, the art, the philosophy, the architecture, the music, and the moral foundations of Western civilization bear his imprint more deeply than that of any other single individual. This is the story of Jesus of Nazareth, his life, his death, his teachings, and his 2,000-year impact on the world. To understand the life of Jesus, you must first understand the world he was born into. Judea in the 1st century BCE was a province on the far eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. Politically unstable, economically strained, and theologically alive with argument and expectation. The Jewish people lived under Roman occupation. Roman soldiers patrolled their streets. Roman tax collectors extracted tribute from their harvests. Roman law superseded their own in matters of capital punishment. The cultural imposition was daily and unavoidable. Roman coins bearing the image of the emperor, Roman temples visible on the hills, Roman authority visible in every public space. And yet the Judaism of this period was not a defeated or passive tradition. It was one of the most intellectually dynamic religious cultures in the ancient world. The Pharisees debated the Torah's meaning with rigorous exactness. The Sadducees navigated the complex politics of the temple and its relationship with Rome. The Essenes withdrew into desert communities, copied scriptures, and waited for the end of the present age. The Zealots argued that armed resistance was the only faithful response to occupation. And across all of these traditions ran a common thread of expectation that God would act, that a Messiah, an anointed deliverer, would come to restore Israel, to bring justice to the oppressed, and to inaugurate a new age. It was into this world of occupation and expectation that Jesus was born. The Gospel accounts, our primary narrative sources, describe his birth in Bethlehem, his upbringing in Nazareth in the Galilee region, his parents as Mary and Joseph of the house of David. These accounts carry theological significance for Christians. The descent from David connects Jesus to the messianic expectation. The virginal conception signals his divine origin. Historians working with secular methods can confirm the broad context. A Jewish teacher from Galilee, born during the reign of Herod the Great, active during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. The details of his early life are not recoverable through historical evidence. We begin to see him clearly only when he emerges as a public figure, at approximately the age of 30. Jesus began his public ministry somewhere around 28 or 29 CE, following his baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. What he taught, and how he taught it, was unlike anything his contemporaries had encountered. The Sermon on the Mount, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, is perhaps the most complete and concentrated expression of Jesus' moral teaching. Its opening lines, the Beatitudes, announce a reversal of the world's ordinary values. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. In a world organized by hierarchy, military power, and the authority of the strong over the weak, these words were not merely consoling. They were revolutionary. Jesus did not simply tell the poor they would be rewarded after death. He told them that God's order, the kingdom of heaven, was already, in some sense, present among them, that the poor, the meek, the hungry for righteousness were not the losers of history's game, but its true protagonists. His teaching on love extended the obligation of care beyond every conventional boundary. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, the neighbor whose care we owe is not defined by tribe, religion, or kinship, but by need. The Samaritan, a member of a people regarded with contempt by many first-century Jews, is the moral hero of the story. The obligation to care crosses every line that separates us from them. Love your enemies, Jesus taught. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who persecute you. These words have been interpreted in many ways across 2,000 years. They have been used to justify passive acceptance of injustice. They have equally inspired some of the most courageous acts of moral resistance in history, from the abolitionists who ended slavery to Martin Luther King's nonviolent civil rights movement. The teaching's power lies partly in its inexhaustibility. It continues to challenge every generation that encounters it. Jesus also taught about the relationship between the individual and God in terms of extraordinary intimacy. He addressed God as Abba, an Aramaic word closer to father or even dad than to the formal address conventional religion used. He told parables of a shepherd leaving 99 sheep to find one that is lost, of a father running toward a returning prodigal son. The God of these parables is not distant, demanding, or indifferent. He is searching, waiting, running. This vision of a God who cares about the individual, not just about nations or armies or cosmic processes, but about the single lost sheep, would prove one of the most enduring ideas in the history of Western thought. Jesus did not simply offer comforting ideas. He challenged, directly and publicly, the structures of power around him. His entry into Jerusalem shortly before Passover, riding on a donkey in deliberate evocation of the messianic prophecy of Zechariah, was a public claim. His driving of the money changers from the temple precincts was a public confrontation with the temple authorities. His teaching in the temple courts, in full public view, in the days that followed was a direct provocation to both the religious establishment and the Roman authorities who depended on the temple's priesthood to maintain order. The religious authorities, the chief priests, and their allies in the Sanhedrin saw in Jesus a threat to the delicate equilibrium they had maintained with Rome. The Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, saw in him a potential trigger for the kind of messianic uprising that required brutal suppression. Neither wanted to act carelessly. Both concluded that action was necessary. The Last Supper, Jesus' final meal with his disciples, held on the Passover, is recorded in all four Gospels. At this meal, Jesus broke bread and shared wine, telling his disciples that these were his body and his blood given for them. This act, the institution of the Eucharist, would become the central ritual of Christian worship for 2,000 years, performed billions of times across every culture on earth. Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed to the authorities by Judas Iscariot, one of his own 12 disciples. He was tried before the Sanhedrin and then before Pontius Pilate. Pilate, according to the Gospel accounts, found no grounds for a capital charge, but under pressure from the crowd and the temple authorities, he authorized the execution. Jesus was crucified, the Roman method of execution reserved for rebels, slaves, and the lowest criminals, on a hill outside Jerusalem called Golgotha, or Calvary. He died within hours. His body was placed in a tomb, and a stone was rolled against the entrance. For his followers, it seemed like the end of everything. The teacher they had believed was the Messiah, the one who would restore Israel, had died as a criminal. The disciples scattered in fear. And then something happened that they could not explain and could not stop talking about. On the third day after the crucifixion, the first day of the week, the tomb was reported empty. The resurrection of Jesus is the central claim of Christianity. It is also the point at which historical and theological inquiry most clearly part ways, because the resurrection, if it occurred in the way the Gospel accounts describe, is by definition a miraculous event, and miraculous events lie outside the domain of historical verification. What historians can say is this: something happened in Jerusalem in the days after the crucifixion that transformed a group of frightened, scattered, disillusioned followers into people willing to proclaim publicly that their executed teacher had risen from the dead, and to maintain that proclamation under torture and, in many cases, to the point of death. The early Christian movement spread not through military force or political patronage, but through personal testimony. The Apostle Paul, who had initially been a vigorous persecutor of the new movement, described his own conversion experience on the road to Damascus as an encounter with the risen Jesus. Whatever the nature of that experience, it produced one of the most remarkable intellectual and missionary careers in ancient history. Paul's letters, written in the 50s CE, are the earliest surviving Christian documents. They show a movement already present across the Mediterranean world. In Corinth, Ephesus, Philippi, Rome, and dozens of other cities. Paul's theological synthesis, his articulation of what the death and resurrection of Jesus meant for all people, not just for Jews, transformed a Jewish messianic movement into a universal religion. The early Christians were a minority, and often a persecuted one. Roman authorities suspected them of antisocial behavior, atheism, they refused to worship the Roman gods, and political subversion. Nero blamed them for the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, and had them executed in the arena. Domitian, Trajan, and other emperors persecuted them intermittently. The letters of the New Testament are full of appeals to courage in the face of suffering. Yet the movement grew. It grew because it offered something the Roman world, for all its material sophistication, could not provide: a community of equality, a God who cared about the individual, a hope that extended beyond death, and a moral framework that called people to a higher standard of love and service. By the early 4th century, Christianity had spread to every province of the Roman Empire and beyond, to Armenia, Ethiopia, Persia, and India. It was still a minority religion, but it was an organized, literate, theologically sophisticated minority, and it was about to change the world. In 312 CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine I prepared to fight a decisive battle for control of the empire at the Milvian Bridge, north of Rome. Constantine later reported that before the battle he had received a vision, or a dream, in which he was shown the Christian symbol and the words, "In this sign, conquer." Whatever the precise nature of the experience, Constantine fought under the Christian symbol, won the battle, and attributed his victory to the Christian God. The following year, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, proclaiming religious toleration throughout the Roman Empire, and specifically restoring to Christians all property that had been confiscated during the persecutions. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential acts of statecraft in world history. Within a generation, Christianity went from a persecuted minority religion to the favored faith of the Roman emperor. Within 2 generations, the Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The religion of Cicero, of Augustus, of Marcus Aurelius, now officially the religion of the empire those men had built. The institutional consequences were enormous. Churches were built on a monumental scale, the great basilicas of Rome, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. The clergy became a privileged and organized class. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened by Constantine himself, began the process of formally defining Christian doctrine, producing the Nicene Creed that is still recited in churches around the world today. And when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, as we examined in episode 15, the church did not fall with it. It survived. In the ruins of the empire, the Pope sat in Rome. The church's administrative structures, its Latin language, its network of bishops and monasteries, preserved both the memory of Rome and the teachings of Jesus through the centuries that followed. The church became, in a very real sense, the continuation of Rome by other means, and through it the words spoken on a Galilean hillside approximately 450 years earlier remained present in European life, shaping, challenging, and inspiring generation after generation. The influence of Jesus Christ on Western civilization is not simply a matter of religious affiliation. It is woven into the structure of the civilization itself, into its laws, its institutions, its art, its understanding of the human person, and its deepest moral assumptions. Begin with the concept of human dignity. The Roman world, for all its achievements, was built on slavery and the absolute subjugation of the defeated. The value of a human life depended on their status, citizen or slave, patrician or plebeian, Roman or barbarian. The idea that every human being, regardless of status or origin, possessed inherent dignity was not a Roman idea. It was a Christian one, derived from the teaching that every person was made in the image of God and was the object of divine love. This idea had consequences that unfolded slowly across centuries. It did not immediately abolish slavery. The Church's record on slavery is complex and often shameful, but it introduced into the moral vocabulary of the West a principle that would eventually be used to challenge every form of dehumanization. The abolitionists of the 18th and 19th centuries argued from explicitly Christian premises. So did the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, many of whom were shaped by Christian natural law tradition, even when they were not themselves believers. The care of the poor was another revolutionary contribution. Roman society was not characterized by organized care for the destitute. The great Roman public buildings were baths, amphitheaters, and temples, monuments to collective entertainment and civic religion. The first hospitals in the Western world were Christian institutions, the first orphanages, the first systematic feeding programs for the poor. The Church established these institutions not as charity in the modern bureaucratic sense, but as a theological obligation. The poor were, in the words of Jesus, the presence of Christ himself. Education followed. The monasteries of the early medieval period, Benedictine, Cistercian, Augustinian, were the primary repositories of literacy and learning in the centuries after Rome's fall. They copied manuscripts, maintained libraries, ran schools. The first universities in European history, Bologna, 1088, Oxford, 1096, Paris, 1150, grew directly out of cathedral schools and were, in their founding purpose, institutions for the study of theology alongside law and medicine. 7 of the 8 Ivy League universities in the United States were founded by Christian denominations. In law, the influence is equally traceable. The concept of natural law, the idea that there is a moral order accessible to human reason that stands above the positive laws of any state, comes from the Stoic philosophical tradition, but was developed and transmitted to Western legal thinking primarily through Christian theologians, above all Thomas Aquinas. The principle that the ruler is subject to the law, not above it, a principle that distinguishes constitutional from despotic government, has deep roots in medieval Christian political theology. Magna Carta, 1215, was negotiated partly by English bishops. In art, the debt is incalculable. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe, Notre Dame, Chartres, Cologne, Salisbury, are the most ambitious architectural achievements of the medieval world, built to direct human attention upward toward the transcendent. The paintings of Giotto, Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and Caravaggio, the core of what we call the Western artistic tradition, are overwhelmingly representations of Christian subjects: the Nativity, the Annunciation, the Pietà, the Last Supper, the Crucifixion, Handel's Messiah, Bach's Mass in B minor and St. Matthew Passion, Beethoven's Missa Solemnis. The greatest works of the Western musical tradition are inseparable from the Christian story they were composed to illuminate. Even the shape of the Western week bears the mark of the Christian inheritance: Sunday as the day of rest and worship, structuring the rhythm of billions of lives. None of this means that Christianity has been uniformly good for human civilization. The record includes the Inquisition, the Crusades, the religious wars that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, the complicity of churches in slavery and colonialism. These are genuine moral failures, and honest history requires naming them alongside the achievements. A faith that teaches the highest standards of love and justice must be judged in part by how far it has fallen short of those standards, but the achievement remains extraordinary. A set of ideas originating with a Jewish teacher in a small occupied province of the ancient world, transmitted through a persecuted minority, institutionalized by an empire's conversion, developed by centuries of theological argument, embodied in hospitals and universities and cathedrals and law codes. These ideas shaped Western civilization more profoundly than any other single intellectual or spiritual tradition. More than 2,000 years have passed since a teacher from the Galilee walked through the fishing villages along the shore of a small inland sea and began to speak. He left no written text, he led no army, he built no institution. He told stories about lost sheep and prodigal sons, about seeds falling on different kinds of soil, about a man beaten on the road whom only a despised outsider stopped to help. He told people that God loved them, not as a crowd, not as a nation, but individually and unconditionally. He told them to love one another as he had loved them. And somehow those words, transmitted through frightened disciples, developed by brilliant theologians, institutionalized by an empire's conversion, embodied in cathedrals and universities and hospitals and law codes, carried across oceans by missionaries whose motives were always mixed and whose methods were sometimes terrible. Those words are still being read, still being argued about, still being lived by 2,000 years later. For 2.4 billion Christians alive today, Jesus is not a historical figure to be assessed from a scholarly distance. He is a living presence, the object of faith, the one whose resurrection they proclaim every Sunday. For historians of every belief and none, he is the most influential individual who ever lived, and one of the most difficult to fully understand, precisely because the historical figure and the object of faith are so deeply intertwined that separating them is like trying to separate the light from the warmth of the sun. What is undeniable is the scale of the impact. Empires rise and fall. Armies advance and retreat. Cities are built and burned. But some turning points in history are not made by armies or empires. They are made by ideas, by stories told on a hillside, by a life lived in love, by a death that his followers refused to accept as final. More than 2,000 years ago, one such turning point began. Its consequences are still unfolding. Historical accuracy notes the dates of Jesus' birth and death. The Gospel of Luke places the birth during the reign of Herod the Great, died 4 BCE, and during a census under Quirinius, usually dated 6 CE. These dates are irreconcilable, and most historians place the birth between 6 and 4 BCE. The death is generally placed in 30 or 33 CE under Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea 26 to 36 CE. The Josephus references. The longer Testimonium Flavianum in Josephus's Antiquities, 18.63 to 64, is generally regarded as partially authentic. The current text appears to have been edited by Christian scribes, but an earlier version probably referred to Jesus' existence, his crucifixion under Pilate, and the continuation of his followers. The Tacitus reference, Annals 15.44, written circa 116 CE, describes Nero blaming the fire of Rome on Christians and refers to Christus, from whom the name had its origin, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. This is widely regarded as the most important non-Christian ancient reference to Jesus. The founding of universities, Bologna, 1088, Oxford, circa 1096 to 1167, Paris, circa 1150 to 1170, are all correctly identified as the first Western universities, and all grew from cathedral schools. The Harvard Christianity connection is correctly stated. Harvard was founded in 1636 by Puritan Congregationalists,